The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the Montana wilderness as Maya Henderson pressed her face against the frost-covered window of the Greyhound bus. At 22, she carried everything she owned in a single duffel bag and had exactly $43 left to her name. The job posting she'd found online had been vague. Caretaker needed for remote mountain property, room and board provided, experience with children preferred, serious inquiries only. What the posting hadn't mentioned was that Thornfield Ranch sat at an elevation of 8,000 feet, accessible only by a treacherous mountain road that hadn't seen proper maintenance in decades. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, Montana, was a collection of weathered buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned by progress sometime in the 1950s. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya had grown up in Detroit's foster care system, moving between homes until she aged out at 18 with no family connections and limited prospects. She'd worked minimum wage jobs for 4 years, gas stations, fast food restaurants, cleaning services, always one paycheck away from homelessness. The mountain caretaker position offered something she'd never had: stability, isolation from the urban chaos that had defined her life, and the chance to start over where nobody knew her. History: the bus driver, a grizzled man named Carl Winters, had been making the Cedar Falls route for over 15 years. As they climbed higher into the mountains, he glanced at Maya in his rearview mirror with obvious concern. "You sure about this destination, miss? Thornfield Ranch ain't exactly what you'd call a welcoming place. Been strange things happening up there for years." "Strange how?" Maya asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Carl adjusted his rear-view mirror to get a better look at her. "Ezra Thornfield's been running that ranch since his daddy died in '89. Big man, keeps to himself mostly, but folks in town have noticed things. Delivery drivers who go up there come back talking about hearing children's voices when there ain't supposed to be any kids on the property. And in winter..." He paused, as if deciding whether to continue. "In winter, search and rescue gets called. Up there more often than anywhere else in the county." The information sent a chill down Maya's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain cold, but she had already committed to the job, and she had nowhere else to go. Her last employment in Detroit had ended when the diner where she worked closed permanently, leaving her with unpaid wages and an eviction notice that forced her to choose between staying and fighting a hopeless legal battle or leaving the city entirely. "What kind of search and rescue calls?" she asked. "Missing persons, mostly. Hikers who went off trail and never came back. Sometimes hunters who knew these mountains better than their own backyards. The official explanation is always exposure or wildlife attacks, but the timing is suspicious. Most of the disappearances happen during the worst winter storms, when visibility is near zero and temperatures drop below survival levels." The bus wound through increasingly treacherous mountain passes as the afternoon light began to fade. Maya could see evidence of avalanches and rock slides that had carved scars into the mountainsides, and she began to understand why the ranch was so isolated. The road to Thornfield wasn't just remote, it was actively dangerous, especially during winter months when weather conditions could change from manageable to deadly in a matter of hours. "There's something else," Carl continued, lowering his voice as if he was sharing a secret. "The federal government has been asking questions about Thornfield Ranch for the past couple of years, something about land use permits and environmental compliance. Ezra Thornfield has lawyers who keep the feds at bay, but word around town is that he's running some kind of operation up there that doesn't match his cattle ranching permits." The revelation added another layer of concern to Maya's decision to work at the ranch. If federal authorities were investigating Thornfield's activities, she might be walking into a situation that was more complicated and dangerous than a simple caretaking job. As they approached the final turn before Thornfield Ranch, Carl pulled the bus to a stop at a weathered wooden sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing. Survivors will be prosecuted." The message was painted in faded red letters that looked like they'd been refreshed multiple times over the years. "This is as far as I go," Carl said, opening the bus door despite the howling wind and blowing snow. "Thornfield's truck should be waiting to take you the rest of the way up the mountain." Maya stepped off the bus into what felt like stepping into a freezer. The altitude and wind made the cold penetrate through her Detroit-purchased winter coat as if she wasn't wearing anything at all. The bus pulled away quickly, leaving her standing alone beside the road with only the sound of wind through pine trees and the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. The truck that emerged from the swirling snow was a massive Ford F-350 with oversized tires and a snowplow attachment that looked like it could push aside small buildings. Behind the wheel sat a man who matched Carl's description of Ezra Thornfield, enormous, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained against his heavy ranch coat and hands that looked like they could crush bones without effort. Ezra. Thornfield climbed out of the truck and approached Maya with movements that were surprisingly graceful for someone of his size. His face was weathered by decades of mountain sun and wind, and his pale blue eyes had the kind of intensity that made conversation feel like an interrogation. "You the caretaker girl from the city?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that Maya couldn't identify. When she nodded, he continued, "Hope you understand what you're getting into. This ain't Detroit. Up here, mistakes get people killed, and the nearest hospital is 3 hours away in good weather." He loaded Maya's duffel bag into the truck's bed as if it weighed nothing, then gestured for her to climb into the passenger seat. The interior of the truck smelled like leather, wood smoke, and something else, something medicinal or chemical that she couldn't identify. "What exactly will my caretaking duties involve?" Maya asked as they began the final ascent to the ranch. Ezra's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "General maintenance, cooking, cleaning. The ranch has been in my family for 4 generations, and it requires constant attention to keep everything operational, especially during winter months. You'll also be helping with some special projects that require discretion." The vague reference to special projects and discretion reminded Maya of Carl's comments about federal investigations and suspicious activities. She was beginning to realize that the job might involve more than basic ranch maintenance. As they climbed higher, the landscape became increasingly desolate. Pine trees gave way to bare rock faces and patches of snow that never melted, even during summer months. The road narrowed to barely more than a trail, with drop-offs that disappeared into misty canyons far below. "How long have you been running the ranch alone?" Maya asked, trying to make conversation while fighting off her growing anxiety about the isolation. "Since my wife died 8 years ago," Ezra replied. "Cancer took her during the worst winter we'd had in decades. Couldn't get her to the hospital in time because of the storms." His voice carried a bitterness that suggested the loss had changed him in fundamental ways. "I'm sorry for your loss." Ezra glanced at her with an expression that was difficult to read. "Death comes for everyone eventually. What matters is what you accomplish while you're still breathing." Thornfield Ranch materialized out of the swirling snow like something from a Gothic novel. The main house was a massive log structure with multiple wings and additions that had been built over several generations. Outbuildings dotted the property, barns, storage sheds, and several structures whose purposes weren't immediately obvious. Most striking was the ranch's position on the mountainside. It sat on a natural plateau that was surrounded on 3 sides by steep cliffs and dense forest. The only access was the narrow road they had just traveled, making the ranch completely isolated from the outside world during severe weather. "Welcome to Thornfield," Ezra said as he parked the truck near the main house. "Hope you don't mind the quiet. Sometimes we don't see another human being for weeks at a time during winter storms." As Maya climbed out of the truck, she immediately noticed something that Carl's warnings hadn't prepared her for. Despite the remote location and harsh weather, there were clear signs of recent activity around the ranch. Fresh tire tracks in the snow led to several of the outbuildings, and she could see lights burning in windows of structures that appeared too small and basic to require electrical power. More puzzling was the sound she heard as the wind died down. Momentarily, somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the natural mountain sounds, came what sounded like children's voices, not playing or laughing, but calling out in what might have been distress or fear. "Do you have children staying at the ranch?" Maya asked, though she was certain the job posting had mentioned that the position was for an adult caretaker only. Ezra's expression hardened. "No children. Sometimes the wind through the canyons makes sounds that can trick you into hearing things that aren't there. Mountain isolation affects people differently. You'll learn to ignore the false signals." But Maya was certain that what she'd heard hadn't been wind through rocks. The voices had been distinctly human, distinctly young, and distinctly afraid. She made a mental note to investigate the source of the sounds once she'd settled into her new position. The interior of the main house was surprisingly modern and well-appointed, with expensive furniture, updated kitchen appliances, and a communication system that included satellite internet and multiple phone lines. The contrast between the remote location and the sophisticated infrastructure suggested that Thornfield Ranch was more than a simple cattle operation. "Your quarters are in the East Wing," Ezra said, leading Maya through a series of hallways lined with family photographs spanning several generations. "Private bathroom, small kitchen, everything you'll need to be comfortable. Meals are provided in the main dining room, and I expect you to be available for work by 7 each morning." Maya's room was larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in, with a stone fireplace, heavy wooden furniture, and windows that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. But what caught her attention was the collection of children's drawings tacked to one wall, crude crayon pictures of mountains, animals, and stick figures that appeared to have been created by young artists. "Whose drawings are these?" she asked. Ezra's face went completely blank for a moment before he responded. "Previous caretakers sometimes brought children to visit. I haven't gotten around to redecorating the room." The explanation felt rehearsed, as if Ezra had answered the same question multiple times before. Maya wondered how many caretakers had worked at Thornfield Ranch, and why they'd left positions that offered steady employment in one of the most beautiful locations she'd ever seen. That evening, Maya joined Ezra for dinner in the ranch's main dining room. The meal was simple, but well prepared. Venison steaks, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread that suggested either Ezra was an accomplished cook or the ranch employed additional staff she hadn't met yet. "Tell me about the special projects you mentioned," Maya said as they ate. Ezra cut his steak with precise, controlled movements. The ranch hosts educational programs for underprivileged children during certain times of the year, government contracts through the Department of Health and Human Services, urban kids who need exposure to outdoor environments and traditional skills. That sounds wonderful. When do the children usually visit? Schedule varies depending on federal funding and weather conditions. Sometimes groups arrive with very little advance notice, especially during emergency placements when children need to be removed from dangerous situations quickly. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Maya noticed that Ezra avoided making direct eye contact when he discussed the children's programs. His body language suggested discomfort with the topic, as if he was sharing information he'd prefer to keep private. After dinner, Maya excused herself to explore her new quarters and begin settling in. As she unpacked her limited belongings, she heard the voices again, definitely children, definitely distressed, and definitely coming from somewhere on the ranch property. She moved to her window and looked out across the snow-covered landscape. Most of the outbuildings were dark, but she could see lights in what appeared to be a large barn or warehouse structure about 200 yards from the main house. The building had multiple levels and appeared to be much newer than the other ranch structures. The children's voices seemed to be coming from the direction of the lit building. Maya spent the next hour watching the structure, trying to determine what activities might be taking place inside. Occasionally, she saw figures moving past the windows, adults who appeared to be wearing heavy winter clothing and moving with purpose through the building's interior. At one point, she thought she saw smaller figures as well, shapes that could have been children, but the distance and swirling snow made it impossible to be certain. Around midnight, the lights in the building went out, and the ranch returned to its nighttime silence. But Maya continued watching from her window, drawn by an instinct that something important was happening in that building, something that Ezra hadn't mentioned when describing her duties. She was about to close the curtains and try to sleep when she saw something that made her heart race with both excitement and terror. A small figure emerged from the building and began moving across the snow toward the main house. The figure appeared to be a child, moving slowly and unsteadily, as if injured or exhausted. Maya grabbed her coat and boots, intending to help the child reach safety. But when she opened her room's door to enter the hallway, she found Ezra Thornfield standing directly outside, still fully dressed despite the late hour. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his massive frame blocking the hallway. "I saw someone outside," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. "A child who looked like they needed help." Ezra moved past her to look out the window, then turned back with an expression she couldn't read. "I don't see anyone. Mountain air and altitude can cause hallucinations, especially for people who aren't accustomed to the environment. You should get some rest." But Maya was certain that what she'd seen hadn't been a hallucination. The child had been real, had been in distress, and had been moving toward the house as if seeking help. Ezra's immediate presence outside her door suggested that he'd been watching her room, waiting to intercept her if she tried to investigate. "Of course," she said, stepping back into her room. "You're probably right. I'm still adjusting to the altitude." Ezra nodded approvingly. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the property and explain your duties in more detail. The ranch operates on strict schedules, especially during winter months when weather conditions can change rapidly. Following protocols isn't just about efficiency, it's about survival." After Ezra left, Maya remained awake for hours, listening for sounds from other parts of the ranch and trying to process what she'd observed. The combination of children's voices, the mysterious lit building, and Ezra's suspicious behavior suggested that Thornfield Ranch was involved in activities that went far beyond cattle ranching or even legitimate children's programs. The job that had represented salvation from poverty and homelessness was beginning to look like something much more dangerous. But Maya had learned during her years in foster care that running from problems often led to worse situations, and she had no money or transportation to leave the mountain, even if she wanted to. As dawn broke over the Montana peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Maya made a decision that would change the course of her life. Instead of fleeing from the mysteries surrounding Thornfield Ranch, she would investigate them. If children were being harmed or exploited on the property, she would find evidence and expose the truth, regardless of the personal cost. The decision was motivated partly by moral obligation and partly by practical necessity. If she was going to survive the winter at Thornfield Ranch, she needed to understand exactly what she'd gotten herself involved in. The voices of distressed children that echoed across the mountain wind were calling to something deep in her past. Memories of her own childhood experiences with adults who had power over vulnerable kids and used that power for purposes that had nothing to do with protection or care. Maya Henderson, the foster kid from Detroit, who had spent 4 years washing dishes and cleaning offices for survival wages, was about to discover that some remote mountain ranches harbored secrets that could shake the foundations of federal child welfare programs and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. But first, she had to survive her first full day at Thornfield Ranch without arousing Ezra's suspicions about her growing determination to uncover the truth about those children's voices in the snow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya's first full day at Thornfield Ranch began at dawn, with the sound of heavy machinery starting up somewhere in the distance. She dressed quickly in the warmest clothes she owned and made her way to the main house's kitchen, where she found a note from Ezra detailing her morning responsibilities. The list was longer and more specific than she'd expected. Feed the livestock in Barn 3, check the generator fuel levels, inspect the perimeter fencing for storm damage, and prepare lunch for 12 individuals, without any explanation of who those individuals might be or where they were housed on the property. The first task took her to the livestock barn, a weathered structure that housed a modest herd of cattle and several horses. The animals appeared well cared for, but Maya noticed that the barn's feed storage area contained far more supplies than would be necessary for the number of animals present. Pallets of grain, hay, and protein supplements were stacked to the ceiling, suggesting that the ranch was feeding a much larger population than the visible livestock. While distributing feed to the cattle, Maya discovered something that made her pause. Mixed in with the standard livestock feed were packages of human food, canned goods, rice, pasta, and other shelf-stable items that had been stored alongside. The animal supplies. The human food bore labels indicating government surplus, the kind distributed through federal food assistance programs. She examined the packages more carefully and found shipping labels addressed to Thornfield Educational Services, with a federal contract number that suggested official government funding. According to the labels, the ranch was receiving monthly deliveries of emergency food supplies sufficient to feed dozens of people for extended periods. The generator inspection revealed another puzzling detail. The ranch's power system was far more sophisticated than necessary for a simple cattle operation. Multiple diesel generators provided backup power to buildings throughout the property, and the fuel consumption logs showed usage patterns that suggested continuous, high-demand electrical needs. Maya followed the power lines from the main generator. Building and discovered, they led not just to the main house and obvious ranch structures, but also to several buildings she hadn't noticed during her arrival. Hidden behind natural rock formations and stands of pine trees were at least 4 additional structures that weren't visible from the main house or access road. As she approached the perimeter fencing, Maya heard the children's voices again. This time they were close enough that she could make out individual words, spoken in what sounded like a Native American language she didn't recognize. The voices came from the direction of one of the hidden buildings, and they carried an urgency that made her heart race with concern. "We're freezing," she heard clearly in English, followed by more words in the native language that sounded like pleas or cries for help. Maya changed direction and began moving toward the source of the voices, using the dense pine forest as cover to avoid being seen from the main house. The building the voices were coming from was newer than the main ranch structures, built with modern materials and featuring several antennas and satellite dishes that suggested sophisticated communication equipment. As she got closer, Maya could see that the building's windows had been covered with heavy curtains or boards, preventing anyone from seeing inside. But she could hear movement and conversation from within, including adult voices speaking in low, urgent tones. She found a position behind a large pine tree that allowed her to observe the building without being detected. Over the next hour, she watched as several adults entered and left the structure through a side door that required them to input a security code on an electronic lock. The adults were dressed in heavy winter clothing that obscured their features, but their movements and behavior suggested professional training. They carried clipboards, spoke into radio devices, and maintained constant awareness of their surroundings in ways that reminded Maya of security personnel or law enforcement officers. Most disturbing was what she observed when one of the adults briefly opened the main door to the building. In that moment, before the door closed again, Maya caught a glimpse of the interior. She saw what appeared to be multiple bunk beds arranged in rows, institutional-style lighting, and several small figures that were definitely children. The children appeared to be Native American, ranging in age from perhaps 8 to 14 years old. They were dressed in identical grey clothing that looked like institutional uniforms, and their movements seemed restricted, as if they were confined to specific areas within the building. Maya felt a surge of outrage and fear as she realized she was looking at what appeared to be some kind of detention facility for children. The educational programs Ezra had mentioned weren't voluntary learning experiences. They were something far more sinister. She remained hidden behind the pine tree for another 30 minutes, documenting everything she observed. The pattern of adult supervision, the security measures, and the children's obvious distress all pointed to a situation that was illegal and potentially life-threatening. When she finally made her way back to the main house, Maya found Ezra waiting for her in the kitchen with an expression that made her blood run cold. "Find everything you were looking for during your morning inspection?" he asked, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Just checking the fencing like you asked," Maya replied, trying to keep her voice casual. "Some of the posts need repair work, but nothing urgent." Ezra studied her face carefully. The mountain environment can be disorienting for people who aren't used to isolation. Sometimes newcomers think they see or hear things that aren't really there. It's important to remember that your job here is specific and limited. Curiosity about other ranch activities isn't part of your responsibilities. The warning was clear, but Maya had already committed herself to investigating further. She nodded agreement while mentally planning her next steps. "I understand. I'm just trying to learn the layout so I can do my job effectively." "Good. This afternoon I'll need you to prepare quarters in Building 7 for new arrivals, 6 individuals who will be staying with us for an extended period. They have special dietary requirements and medical needs that will require careful attention." Maya felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of special needs?" "Nothing you can't handle with proper instruction. The important thing is following protocols." "Exactly. These individuals have been through traumatic experiences, and any deviation from established procedures could cause significant problems." After Ezra left for his afternoon ranch work, Maya took advantage of his absence to explore the property more thoroughly. She found Building 7, which turned out to be another institutional-style structure with multiple small rooms that looked like cells more than bedrooms. Each room contained a single bed, a small desk, and a metal toilet that reminded Maya of juvenile detention facilities she'd visited during her foster care years. The windows were small and positioned high on the walls, making it impossible for occupants to see outside or for anyone to see in. Most disturbing was the discovery she made in the building's supply room: stacks of children's clothing in various sizes, all bearing tags from federal surplus suppliers. Medical supplies, including sedatives and restraints typically used in psychiatric facilities. And most shocking of all, a bulletin board covered with photographs of Native American children, each photo labeled with a number rather than a name. The photographs showed children of various ages and tribal affiliations, but all shared expressions of fear and confusion that suggested they hadn't been willing participants in whatever programs the ranch was operating. Some of the photos were clearly surveillance images taken without the subject's knowledge, while others appeared to be official identification photos from government agencies. Maya photographed the bulletin board and supply inventory with her phone, though she wasn't sure how she would transmit the images from the ranch's isolated location. She was examining the medical supplies more closely when she heard footsteps approaching the building. She quickly concealed herself in a storage closet just as Ezra entered the building with two companions she hadn't seen before. Through the crack in the closet door, she could see that the new arrivals were wearing federal government identification badges and carrying briefcases that suggested official business. "The new group arrives tonight," one of the federal agents was saying. 6 individuals from the Pine Ridge Reservation, ages 8 to 13, all classified as emergency removals due to family dysfunction and substance abuse issues. "Transportation?" Ezra asked. "Unmarked vehicle, standard protocols. The families have been told that the children are being placed in a federal boarding facility for educational and therapeutic services. Duration of stay is listed as indefinite, pending family reunification assessments." Maya felt sick as she realized she was listening to a conversation about kidnapping children under the guise of federal child welfare services. The emergency removals were apparently being used to take Native American children from their families and bring them to Thornfield Ranch for purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate education or therapy. "Any problems with the previous group?" the second federal agent asked. Ezra's voice became harder. 2 of them required additional persuasion to accept the program structure, but they're adapting to the protocols. The isolation and controlled environment are effective in breaking down resistance to authority. Good. The research sponsors are pleased with the preliminary data. The psychological conditioning techniques you've developed here are showing promising results for large-scale implementation in other locations. The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow. The children weren't just being kidnapped, they were being used as test subjects in psychological experiments, probably funded by federal agencies and conducted under the cover of legitimate child welfare services. "What about long-term disposition?" the first agent asked. "The sponsors are asking about permanent placement options for subjects who complete the full program cycle." Ezra was quiet for a long moment. "Some subjects adapt successfully and can be integrated into controlled community environments. Others prove more resistant to conditioning and require alternative solutions." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what Maya understood to be a discussion about murdering children who didn't respond to whatever psychological torture was being inflicted on them. The alternative solutions were almost certainly the disappearances that had prompted search and rescue operations throughout the region. After the federal agents left, Maya remained hidden in the storage closet for another hour, trying to process the enormity of what she'd discovered. Thornfield Ranch wasn't just a remote cattle operation, it was a federal black site where Native American children were being subjected to illegal psychological experiments under the cover of child welfare services. The scope of the conspiracy involved multiple levels of government, from local law enforcement, who ensured that disappearances weren't properly investigated, to federal agents who provided official cover for the kidnapping operations. The research sponsors mentioned by the agents suggested that the experiments were funded by agencies with significant resources and political protection. As evening approached, Maya made her way back to the main house to prepare dinner for Ezra and whatever other staff might be present. She had to appear normal and compliant while internally planning an investigation that could expose one of the most heinous crimes she could imagine. The kitchen preparation gave her time to think about her options. She had no transportation, no reliable communication with the outside world, and no way to verify whether local law enforcement could be trusted. Even if she could somehow contact federal authorities, the involvement of federal agents in the conspiracy meant that she couldn't be certain who might be trustworthy. Her phone had no signal at the ranch's elevation, and the landline phones were all located in areas where Ezra could easily monitor her conversations. The satellite internet system was password protected and appeared to be used only for official ranch business. As she cooked dinner, Maya heard a new sound that made her freeze with horror. From somewhere outside came a child's voice speaking, clearly in English despite the wind and distance. "We're freezing, sir," the voice said, so distinctly that Maya could hear the desperation and exhaustion in the words. "Please, we're so cold." The voice was followed by Ezra's unmistakable response, carried on the mountain wind. "Then stay forever." The exchange confirmed Maya's worst fears about what was happening to the children at Thornfield Ranch. They were being subjected to deliberate exposure and hypothermia as part of the psychological conditioning experiments, and those who couldn't survive the ordeal were being left to die in the mountain cold. Maya gripped the kitchen counter to steady herself. As the full horror of the situation became clear, she wasn't just witnessing child abuse, she was an unwitting participant in a government-sponsored program that was systematically torturing and murdering Native American children under the cover of educational and therapeutic services. The realization that she needed to act immediately, regardless of the personal danger, crystallized her resolve. Tomorrow, she would begin documenting everything she could observe about the ranch's operations, gathering evidence that could expose the conspiracy and save the children who were still alive. But tonight, as she served dinner to Ezra Thornfield and tried to appear oblivious to what she'd discovered, Maya Henderson began planning an investigation that would either bring justice to the murdered children of Thornfield Ranch or add her name to the list of people who had disappeared in the Montana mountains during the worst winter storms in decades. Maya spent her second day at Thornfield Ranch methodically mapping the property while completing her assigned tasks. Using the excuse of checking fence lines and equipment, she documented the location of every building, vehicle, and piece of infrastructure that might be relevant to the illegal operation she'd discovered. The ranch was larger and more complex than it appeared from the main house. Hidden valleys and natural rock formations concealed structures that couldn't be seen from the access road or primary buildings. Maya counted at least 12 separate facilities, including what appeared to be dormitories, administrative buildings, and several structures whose purposes she couldn't determine from external observation. Most concerning was Building 12, a windowless concrete structure built into the mountainside that required keycard access and was surrounded by motion sensor equipment. The building's design and security features suggested it housed something that required maximum containment, possibly dangerous materials or high-value assets. During her fence inspection, Maya discovered tire tracks in the snow that led to a service road she hadn't noticed before. The tracks were fresh, made by heavy vehicles within the past 24 hours, and they led deeper into the mountains toward areas that weren't visible from any of the ranch's official buildings. Following the tracks for about half a mile, Maya came across what appeared to be a dumping ground. Scattered across a small clearing were items that made her stomach turn with revulsion and fear. Children's clothing, torn and stained with what looked like blood. Personal items including jewelry, hair accessories, and small toys that would have belonged to young people. Most horrifying were the bone fragments she found partially buried in the snow. They were small, clearly from children or young teenagers, and showed evidence of trauma that couldn't be explained by natural causes or animal predation. Maya photographed everything she found, though her hands were shaking so badly from cold. and terror that she wasn't sure the images would be clear enough to serve as evidence. The dumping ground represented proof that children had been murdered at Thornfield Ranch, their bodies disposed of in remote areas where they would never be found by searchers. As she documented the scene, Maya heard something that made her freeze. With a combination of fear and impossible hope, a child's voice speaking directly behind her, though when she turned around she saw only empty forest. "They threw us away like garbage," the voice said, belonging to what sounded like a young girl. "But we're still here, we're still watching. Who are you?" Maya whispered, feeling foolish for talking to empty air, but compelled by the desperate sadness in the voice. "My name was Sarah Crowfeather. I was 11 when they brought me here from the reservation. They said my grandmother was sick and couldn't take care of me anymore, but my grandmother was fine. They lied to get me away from my family." Maya felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she realized she was communicating with the spirit of a murdered child. How many others are there? Dozens. They've been bringing children here for 3 years. Some of us survived the experiments and were sent away to other places, but the ones who fought back, who tried to escape or refused to cooperate, we ended up here in the forest. The revelation that Thornfield Ranch had been operating as a child experimentation facility for 3 years made Maya understand the true scope of the horror she'd uncovered. If children had been disappearing from reservations across the region for that long, hundreds of families had been destroyed by lies about emergency removals and therapeutic placements. "What kind of experiments?" Maya asked. Sarah's ghostly presence seemed to strengthen as she spoke. "They wanted to see how much cold, hunger, and fear children could endure before we broke completely. They tested drugs that made us confused and scared. They separated siblings and told us our families had abandoned us. They wanted to destroy our connection to our culture and our people." The description matched what Maya had read about historical government programs designed to assimilate Native American children by forcibly removing them from their families and communities. But the Thornfield experiments seemed to be an even more extreme version, using modern psychological torture techniques and medical experimentation to achieve complete psychological destruction. "How can I help you?" Maya asked. "Document everything. Find the records they keep about each child. Get the evidence to someone who can stop them before they murder more of us." And Sarah's voice became fainter, as if she was struggling to maintain contact. "Find the children who are still alive. They're in Building 12, the one you couldn't get into. They don't have much time left." As Sarah's presence faded, Maya heard the sound of approaching vehicles. She quickly concealed the bone fragments and personal items she'd been photographing, then made her way back toward the ranch buildings through the forest cover. From her hiding place behind a storage shed, she watched as a black SUV with government license plates pulled up to the main house. 2 individuals in federal agent attire emerged from the vehicle and were greeted by Ezra, who seemed to have been expecting their arrival. Maya crept closer to the main house, using the outbuildings as cover, and positioned herself where she could hear the conversation taking place on the front porch. "The new subjects arrived this morning," one of the agents was saying. 6 individuals from Pine Ridge, all fitting the demographic profile you requested. Ages 8 to 14, minimal family support systems, previous exposure to government, intervention services. "Excellent," Ezra replied. "How much time do we have before anyone starts asking questions about their whereabouts?" Standard protocol provides a 6-month window before Family Services conducts follow-up evaluations. By then, either the subjects will have completed the conditioning program successfully, or they'll have been transferred to alternative disposition facilities. Maya realized she was listening to federal agents discussing the kidnapping and potential murder of 6 more children with the same casual tone they might use to discuss livestock delivery schedules. The alternative disposition facilities were clearly death camps or body disposal sites. What about the research timeline? Ezra asked. The sponsors are asking for accelerated results. Phase 3 testing begins immediately. We've refined the psychological conditioning protocols based on data from previous subjects. The new pharmaceuticals should produce faster behavioral modification with reduced resistance patterns. And if the subjects don't respond to the new protocols, then they become part of the control group that provides baseline data for comparison purposes. Either way, their participation contributes to the research objectives. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the fact that Maya was listening to a discussion about torturing children to death in the name of psychological research. The sponsors mentioned by the agents suggested that the experiments were being funded by organizations with significant resources and political protection. After the agents left, Maya made her way back to her quarters in a state of near panic. She had uncovered evidence of a systematic program to kidnap and murder Native American children, but she had no way to contact law enforcement without risking her own life or the lives of the children currently being held at the ranch. Her phone remained useless for communication, but she realized it could serve as a documentation device. Over the next several hours, she used the camera to record video evidence of everything she had observed, including the dumping ground, the institutional buildings, and the government vehicles that serviced the ranch. That evening, as she prepared dinner for the expected 12 individuals, Maya heard new voices joining Sarah Crowfeather's spirit communication. Other murdered children were reaching out to her, providing information about the ranch's operations and guidance about how to gather evidence that could expose the conspiracy. "The records are in Ezra's office," whispered a boy's voice she hadn't heard before. "He keeps files on every child who has been brought here. Names, family information, experiment results, disposition codes. Everything you need to prove what they've done." "How do I get into his office?" Maya asked quietly. "The security system has a manual override in the main electrical panel," another child's voice explained. "Building maintenance access that bypasses the electronic locks. But you have to be careful. Ezra checks the office every night before he goes to sleep." Armed with supernatural guidance and growing determination, Maya began planning a nighttime infiltration of Ezra's office that would either provide the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy or get her killed in the process. She knew that 6 new children would arrive that night, and time was running out to prevent them from becoming the next victims of Thornfield Ranch's horrific experiments. The investigation that had begun with strange voices in the mountain wind was about to escalate into a race against time to save innocent lives and expose a government conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal child welfare agencies. As snow began falling again outside her window, Maya Henderson prepared to risk everything in an attempt to speak for the dead children whose voices called to her from the Montana wilderness, demanding justice for crimes that had been hidden in the isolation of America's most remote mountains. At 2 a.m., Maya crept through the darkened corridors of the main house toward Ezra's office. The spirits of the murdered children guided her steps, whispering warnings about creaking floorboards and motion sensors that could trigger alarms. Their voices had grown stronger throughout the day, as if her willingness to investigate their deaths had given them more power to communicate with the living. "Third step, from the top squeaks," Sarah Crowfeather's voice warned as Maya approached. "The staircase leading to the office level. Step on the right edge only." The electrical panel was located in a utility closet near Ezra's office, exactly where the children's spirits had indicated. Maya used the flashlight app on her phone to examine the complex array of switches and circuit breakers until she found the manual override system. A simple toggle switch labeled Security Bypass Maintenance Mode would disable the electronic locks for 30 minutes. When Maya flipped the switch, she heard the subtle click of electronic deadbolts disengaging throughout the building. The security system's LED indicators shifted from red to amber, indicating that the building was now in maintenance mode with reduced protection protocols. Ezra's office was larger and more sophisticated than Maya had expected. One wall was covered with topographical maps, marking locations throughout Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Red pins marked dozens of sites, each labeled with codes that appeared to indicate operational facilities similar to Thornfield Ranch. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than Maya had imagined. Based on the map markings, similar operations were being conducted at remote locations across the northern Great Plains region, all targeting Native American communities with established federal trust relationships. Maya photographed the maps before turning her attention to Ezra's filing cabinets, which had also been unlocked by the security bypass. The first cabinet contained administrative records for legitimate ranch operations, cattle inventories, feed purchases, equipment maintenance, schedules. But the second cabinet held files that made Maya's hands shake with rage and horror. Each file contained complete records for children who had been brought to Thornfield Ranch. The documentation included original family information, fabricated reports justifying emergency removal from their homes, medical records from the experiments conducted at the ranch, and final disposition codes indicating what had happened to each child. Maya photographed dozens of files, each representing a young life that had been destroyed by the conspiracy. The children ranged in age from 6 to 16 years old, and they had been taken from reservations across multiple states. The fabricated removal reports cited identical justifications: family substance abuse, domestic violence, educational neglect, that provided legal cover for the kidnappings. The medical records documented systematic torture disguised as psychological research. Children were subjected to extreme temperature exposure, sensory deprivation, pharmaceutical experimentation, and psychological conditioning techniques designed to break their connection to their cultural identity and family memories. Most disturbing were the disposition codes used to track what happened to children who completed various phases of the program. Code Green indicated successful conditioning and transfer to integration facilities in urban areas. Code Yellow meant partial conditioning success with transfer to secondary research sites for continued experimentation. Code Red indicated research failure and environmental disposal. Maya realized she was looking at the bureaucratic records of mass murder, with each red code representing a child who had been tortured to death and dumped in the mountain wilderness. According to the files, over 60 children had received red disposition codes during the 3 years of operation. The most shocking discovery was in the final filing cabinet, which contained correspondence between Thornfield Ranch and the federal agencies funding the research. The letters revealed that the psychological conditioning experiments were part of a larger program designed to develop techniques for cultural modification and identity reconstruction that could be applied to entire populations. The research sponsors included agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security. The stated goal was to develop methods for peaceful assimilation of resistant cultural groups that could be applied to immigration detention centers, refugee camps, and other facilities housing people considered threats to national security. Native American children were being used as test subjects because their cultural identity was considered particularly strong and resistant to traditional assimilation techniques. If the experiments could successfully destroy the cultural connections of Native American children, the same techniques could theoretically be applied to any group the government wanted to control or eliminate. Maya photographed every document she could find, including budget reports showing that the program had received over $50 million in federal funding. The money had been distributed through shell organizations and legitimate-sounding research grants that concealed the true nature of the experiments. As she worked, the voices of the murdered children provided additional information about the conspiracy's structure and operations. They told her about visits from high-ranking federal officials who came to observe the experiments firsthand. They described transportation networks that moved children between different facilities to prevent any single location from attracting attention. "There are places like this all over the country," Sarah Crowfeather's spirit explained. "Urban facilities disguised as youth treatment centers, rural compounds hidden in national forests, military bases with special research units. They're building a system to destroy any group that threatens their vision of American society." Maya was photographing the final set of documents when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside the office. Someone was moving through the building, apparently conducting a security check that hadn't been scheduled. She quickly gathered the files she'd been examining and looked for a place to hide. The office had a large window that opened onto a second-floor balcony, but the drop to the ground was too far to attempt without serious injury. Her only option was to conceal herself behind Ezra's massive wooden desk and hope that whoever was checking the building wouldn't enter the office. The footsteps stopped outside the office door, and Maya heard the sound of someone testing the electronic lock. When the lock didn't respond normally due to the maintenance bypass, the person outside began using a manual key to unlock the door. Ezra Thornfield entered the office carrying a flashlight and wearing a heavy coat that suggested he'd been outside, conducting perimeter checks. He moved directly to his desk, apparently following a routine that brought him to the office during his nightly security rounds. Maya pressed herself against the floor behind the desk, trying to control her breathing, while Ezra moved around the office checking windows and examining his filing cabinets. She could hear him opening drawers and moving papers, apparently verifying that nothing had been disturbed. "I know you're in here," Ezra said suddenly, his voice calm but threatening. "Your footprints are still visible in the hallway carpet, and you left the security system in maintenance mode. Come out now, and we can discuss this situation like adults." Maya remained hidden, hoping that Ezra was bluffing and hadn't actually detected her presence. But his next words made her realize that escape was no longer possible. "I've been monitoring your activities since you arrived, Maya Henderson. Motion sensors throughout the property have tracked your unauthorized exploration and thermal imaging. Equipment recorded your visits to areas that are off-limits to caretaking staff. You've seen things that require explanation." Ezra moved around the desk and looked directly at Maya's hiding place. Up close, his size was even more intimidating, and his pale blue eyes held an intelligence that suggested he'd been aware of her investigation from the beginning. "Stand up," he commanded, and Maya realized she had no choice but to comply. "How long have you known?" she asked as she rose to her feet. "Since your second day here. The ranch's security system is designed to detect and monitor any unauthorized activity. I've been allowing you to conduct your investigation because I wanted to understand your motivations and capabilities." Maya felt a surge of terror as she realized that her investigation had been observed and potentially controlled from the beginning. "Are you going to kill me?" Ezra studied her face carefully before responding. "That depends on what you do with the information you've gathered. The research being conducted here serves important national security objectives. Hundreds of millions of Americans benefit from the stability and security that our work provides. By torturing children to death? by developing techniques that prevent cultural conflicts from escalating into violence and terrorism. The children who participate in our research contribute to solutions that prevent wars and save thousands of lives. Their sacrifice has meaning, beyond their individual circumstances. Maya felt sick as she listened to Ezra justify mass murder with bureaucratic language and nationalist rhetoric. Their innocent children being tortured by their own government. Their test subjects providing data that advances human knowledge and improves societal outcomes. Every major scientific advance requires sacrifices from people who don't fully understand the larger implications of their contribution. The conversation was interrupted by new voices that only Maya could hear, the spirits of murdered children gathering in the office with increasing strength and anger. Their whispered words began to affect the physical environment, causing papers to flutter and electronic equipment to malfunction. "You can hear them, can't you?" Ezra asked, apparently noticing Maya's reaction to the supernatural presence. The psychological stress of discovering classified information sometimes causes auditory hallucinations. It's a documented phenomenon in intelligence work, but Maya knew that what she was experiencing wasn't hallucination. The children's spirits were real, and they were growing more powerful as their anger intensified. The temperature in the office dropped noticeably, and frost began forming on the windows despite the building's heating system. "They want justice," Maya said, "and they're not going to rest until they get it." Ezra reached for his radio to call for backup, but the device wouldn't function in the supernatural environment that was building around them. The lights flickered, and Maya could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. "The children you murdered are still here," she continued, "and they're going to make sure the truth about what you've done gets exposed." As if responding to her words, the office door slammed shut and the electronic locks engaged, trapping both Maya and Ezra. Inside, the spirits of dozens of murdered children were gathering for a confrontation that would determine whether their deaths would be avenged or covered up forever. Maya Henderson, the foster kid from Detroit who had taken a caretaker job to escape. Poverty was about to become the focal point of a supernatural uprising that would expose one of the most horrific government conspiracies in American history. The voices that had called to her from the mountain wind were finally strong enough to fight back against those who had silenced them in life. The supernatural energy in Ezra's office reached a crescendo as the spirits of murdered children manifested. With unprecedented clarity, Maya could see them now. Dozens of young faces, their features distinct despite the translucent quality of their forms. They ranged from small children to teenagers, all wearing the grey institutional clothing she'd glimpsed in the detention buildings. Sarah Crow Feather stepped forward from the group, her spirit form more solid than the others. "We've been waiting for someone like you," she said to Maya, "someone who could see us, hear us, and act on what we revealed. But we need you to do more than just document our murders." "What do you mean?" Maya asked while Ezra backed against the far wall, his confidence shattered by phenomena he couldn't explain or control. "There are 6 children in Building 12 who are still alive," another spirit explained, a boy who appeared to be around 10 years old. "They arrived 3 days ago, and the experiments begin tomorrow night. If you don't act now, they'll join us before the weekends." Maya felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. It wasn't enough to expose the conspiracy after the fact. She had to prevent more murders from occurring. "How can I get them out? The building is heavily secured, and I have no transportation off the mountain." "We can help," Sarah said. "Our anger has given us strength to affect the physical world in ways we couldn't when we were first killed. We can disable security systems, open locks, create distractions, but you have to be the one who actually saves them." Ezra, who had been listening to Maya's side of the conversation with growing alarm, finally found his voice. "You're having a psychological breakdown. The isolation and stress have triggered auditory and visual hallucinations. I can get you medical treatment if you cooperate with security protocols." Maya turned to face him, her fear transformed into righteous anger. "They're not hallucinations. They're the spirits of the children you've murdered, and they're here to make sure you pay for what you've done." As if responding to her words, the children's spirits focused their attention on Ezra. The temperature in the room dropped below freezing, and frost began forming on every surface. Ezra's breath misted in the frigid air as he experienced the same deadly cold he had inflicted on dozens of innocent victims. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "I was following orders. The program has congressional oversight. Everything we did was authorized by people with higher security clearances than mine." "You had choices," Sarah's spirit replied, her voice carrying the authority of the grave. "Every time you heard a child crying for help, every time you saw one of us dying from your experiments, you chose to continue. You chose to become a monster." The supernatural cold intensified until Ezra collapsed to his knees, his massive frame racked with uncontrollable shivering. Maya realized that the children's spirits were giving him a taste of the hypothermia deaths he had inflicted on them, but they weren't planning to kill him quickly or mercifully. "Wait," Maya said to the spirits. "Don't kill him yet. We need information about how to save the 6 children who are still alive. If he dies now, we might not be able to get them out safely." Sarah looked at Maya with an expression that mixed disappointment with understanding. "You're right. Justice for us doesn't matter if more children die because we acted too quickly." The supernatural cold reduced to merely uncomfortable levels, allowing Ezra to regain enough composure to speak coherently. Maya knelt beside him and spoke with quiet intensity. "Tell me everything about Building 12, security systems, schedules, personnel. If you help me save those children, maybe your death won't be as slow and agonizing as the deaths you inflicted on these kids." Ezra looked around the room at the gathered spirits, his face pale with terror at the supernatural justice surrounding him. "Building 12 is the primary research facility. Maximum security, biometric locks, armed guards during experiment periods. The children are kept in individual cells with continuous monitoring." "How many guards? What kind of weapons? What are their shift patterns?" "Usually 4 guards during active research periods, 2 during overnight hours. Standard federal law enforcement equipment, handguns, tasers, restraint devices. Guard shifts change at midnight and 6 a.m. Maya checked her phone for the time. It was nearly 3 a.m., which meant the overnight security staff would be at minimum levels. "How do I get the children out once I reach Building 12? Master control room on the 2nd level has emergency releases for all the cell doors, but you'll need administrator access codes to operate the system. What are the codes?" Ezra hesitated, apparently still hoping to preserve some aspect of the conspiracy even in his current circumstances. The children's spirits responded to his reluctance by lowering the temperature again, and frost began forming on his clothing. "The codes change daily," he gasped. "But there's a backup system, physical key override in the master control room. Red key in the emergency lockbox." Sarah Crowfeather moved closer to Maya. "He's telling the truth about the backup system. I was held in Building 12 for 2 weeks before they decided I was too resistant for successful conditioning." The red key opens all the cell doors simultaneously. Maya stood and moved toward the office door, which was still sealed by the supernatural lockdown. "Can you open this so I can get to Building 12? "Yes, but you need to understand something," Sarah replied. "Once you enter that building, you'll be in extreme danger. The guards have orders to kill anyone who tries to interfere with the research program. We can provide some protection, but our power is limited in areas where we weren't murdered. What about getting the children off the mountain once they're free? One of the older spirits, a teenage boy with distinctive facial tattoos that identified him as Lakota, stepped forward. There's an emergency radio in the main communications building. If you can reach it, you can contact the FBI field office in Billings. Agent Rebecca Martinez has been investigating missing children cases from Montana reservations. She's trustworthy. Maya felt a surge of hope at learning that legitimate law enforcement was already investigating the conspiracy. How do you know about Agent Martinez? Her younger brother was brought here 6 months ago, the Lakota boy explained. She's been searching for him ever since, following leads that brought her close to discovering Thornfield Ranch. If you can contact her with specific location information and evidence of what's happening here, she can coordinate a federal response. The plan began to crystallize in Maya's mind. She would infiltrate Building 12, free the 6 imprisoned children, and guide them to the communications building where she could contact Agent Martinez with their location and evidence of the conspiracy. The children's spirits would provide supernatural assistance to overcome security systems and guards. What about transportation once the FBI responds? Maya asked. How do we ensure the children survive the mountain weather while we're waiting for rescue? Emergency shelter in the communications building, another spirit replied. Heated, stocked with supplies, designed to support personnel during winter emergencies. If you can get the children there safely, they can survive until federal agents arrive. Maya turned back to Ezra, who was still huddled on the floor under the supernatural assault of the children's spirits. Is there anything else I need to know about the security systems or the building layouts? Motion sensors throughout the property, he whispered, but they're designed to detect unauthorized personnel, not escaping research subjects. The children's biometric data is programmed to allow movement between buildings during emergency situations. Sarah nodded confirmation. He's right about the motion sensors. We've watched guard responses to various situations. If the children are with you, the security system will classify your movement as authorized escort duty rather than unauthorized intrusion. The alliance between Maya and the spirits was providing information and capabilities that made the rescue mission possible. But Maya understood that success would require perfect timing and exceptional courage. She would be facing armed federal agents with orders to kill anyone who interfered with their operations. There's something else you need to know, Sarah said, her spirit form beginning to fade as dawn approached. The experiment scheduled for tomorrow night is the final phase for all 6 children. If the psychological conditioning doesn't achieve complete success, they'll be terminated and disposed of like we were. This is your only chance to save them. Maya felt the enormous pressure of having just hours to plan and execute a mission that would either save 6 innocent lives or result in her own death along with theirs. But the alternative, allowing more children to be tortured and murdered, was unacceptable. I'll do it, she said to the assembled spirits. Help me save them, and then you can have whatever justice you want from Ezra and the others responsible for your deaths. As the first light of dawn began to penetrate the office windows, the children's spirits began to fade back into the supernatural realm where they waited for justice. But their presence remained as a constant reminder that Maya was not acting alone in her mission to expose and end the horrors of Thornfield Ranch. We'll be watching, Sarah whispered, as her form became translucent. And when the time comes for the final confrontation, we'll be strong enough to ensure that everyone responsible for our murders faces the consequences of their choices. Maya Henderson, armed with supernatural allies and driven by moral outrage, began planning a mission that would either bring down one of the most horrific government conspiracies in American history or add her name to the long list of people who had disappeared forever in the isolated mountains of Montana. Maya waited until 4 a.m. before beginning her infiltration of Building 12. The children's spirits had confirmed that the overnight guard shift would be at minimum staffing, with only 2 security personnel monitoring the detention facility during the early morning hours. Snow continued falling heavily, providing natural cover for her approach across the open ground between the main house and the research complex. The spirits guided her movement through whispered directions that helped her avoid motion sensors and surveillance cameras positioned throughout the property. Sarah Crow Feather's presence was strongest, her ghostly form occasionally becoming visible as she scouted ahead to identify potential obstacles. "Guards are in the main monitoring station on the first floor," Sarah whispered as Maya crept toward. "Building 12. One is asleep at his desk, the other is making coffee in the break room. You have maybe 10 minutes before they complete their hourly security check." Maya reached the building's service entrance, which was secured with both electronic locks and traditional deadbolts. The children's spirits focused their supernatural energy on the locking mechanisms, causing the electronics to malfunction, while the mechanical components became so cold they contracted enough to allow the door to open. The interior of Building 12 was even more horrific than Maya had imagined. The first floor contained administrative offices and monitoring equipment that displayed live video feeds from the detention cells. Maya could see 6 children on the screens, all appearing to be between 8 and 14 years old, huddled on narrow beds in rooms that were barely larger than prison cells. The children appeared to be suffering from the effects of whatever drugs had been administered to them during the initial conditioning process. They moved sluggishly, responded minimally to their environment, and showed signs of the psychological trauma that had been systematically inflicted on them. Maya located the stairway leading to the second-floor master control room, where the emergency key override system would allow her to open all the cell doors simultaneously. The spirits of murdered children moved ahead of her, using their supernatural abilities to disable motion sensors and surveillance cameras that might have detected her unauthorized presence. The master control room contained sophisticated monitoring equipment that tracked every aspect of the children's physical and psychological condition. Heart rate monitors, brain activity sensors, and video surveillance provided continuous data about the effects of whatever experimental procedures were being conducted. Maya found the emergency lockbox exactly where Ezra had described it. The red key inside was marked with federal government identification codes and warnings about unauthorized use. When she inserted the key and turned it, alarms should have sounded throughout the building, but the children's spirits had disabled the security systems that would have alerted the guards to the mass cell door release. On the detention level, Maya heard the simultaneous clicking of 6 electronic locks. Disengaging, the cell doors swung open, revealing children who were too drugged and traumatized to immediately understand that they were being rescued. Maya moved quickly from cell to cell, gently waking each child and explaining in whispered tones that she was there to help them escape. The children responded slowly, their movements hampered by whatever pharmaceuticals had been used to keep them compliant during their imprisonment. "Can you walk?" Maya asked a girl who appeared to be around 10 years old. The child nodded weakly, though her coordination was clearly affected by the drugs in her system. "My name is Maya. I'm going to get you out of here and take you somewhere safe, but we have to move quietly and quickly." The oldest of the children, a boy around 14, was more alert than the others. "Are you with the people who brought us here?" he asked suspiciously. "No, I'm here to rescue you, but we don't have much time before the guards discover that you're missing." As Maya gathered the children and prepared to lead them out of the building, her worst fears were realized. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the facility as the security guards began their hourly check of the detention area. "Someone's opened all the cells," a guard's voice shouted. "We have a security breach in the detention level. All units respond immediately." Maya heard radio communications as additional security personnel were summoned to the building. Her escape route through the service entrance was now blocked by guards who were conducting a systematic search of the facility. "This way, Sarah," Crowfeather's spirit called, appearing near an emergency exit that Maya hadn't noticed during her initial reconnaissance. "The exit leads directly to the forest. If you can reach the trees, you can follow the old logging road to the communications building." Maya gathered the 6 children around her, supporting those who were having difficulty walking due to the effects of the drugs. "Stay close to me and follow exactly where I go," she instructed. "If we get separated, head toward the big building with the radio towers." The emergency exit opened onto a loading dock that provided temporary concealment from the guards searching the building's interior. But Maya could see flashlight beams moving through the windows, indicating that the security team was expanding their search to include the exterior areas. The distance between Building 12 and the tree line was about 50 yards across, open ground covered with deep snow. Maya realized that she and the children would be completely exposed during their escape attempt, with nowhere to hide if guards emerged from the building during their crossing. "We can create a distraction," Sarah's spirit offered. "Draw the guards away from your escape route while you get the children to safety." "How?" "We'll trigger alarms in other buildings throughout the property. The guards will have to split up to respond to multiple security alerts, giving you time to reach the forest." As if responding to Sarah's plan, alarm systems began sounding throughout the Thornfield ranch complex. Emergency lights activated in buildings across the property, and Maya could hear vehicles starting as security teams mobilized to respond to what appeared to be a coordinated attack on multiple facilities. The distraction worked exactly as planned. Guards rushed out of Building 12 toward other locations where alarms were indicating security breaches, leaving Maya's escape route temporarily unguarded. "Now," Sarah whispered. "Go now while they're distracted." Maya led the 6 children across the open ground toward the forest, half carrying those who were too weak to run on their own. The snow was knee-deep in places, making progress slow and exhausting, but the children pushed forward with determination born of desperation to escape their captivity. They reached the tree line just as Maya heard shouts behind them, indicating that the guards had discovered the children's absence. Flashlight beams began sweeping the area where they had been running, but the forest provided enough cover to conceal their continued movement. The old logging road that Sarah had mentioned was barely visible under the accumulated snow, but it provided a relatively clear path through the dense pine forest. Maya guided the children along the road, constantly looking back for signs of pursuit while trying to keep the group together, despite their varying levels of physical capability. The youngest child, a girl around 8 years old, collapsed after they had traveled about half a mile. She was unconscious and showing signs of severe hypothermia that would be fatal if she didn't receive immediate medical attention. "I can't carry her and help the others too," Maya realized with growing panic. The communications building was still over a mile away, and the temperature was dropping as dawn approached. "Leave me and take the others," the oldest boy said, though Maya could see that he was also struggling with the effects of exhaustion and cold. "She's too little to survive much longer out here." Maya refused to abandon any of the children. She picked up the unconscious girl and continued leading the group toward the communications building, though their pace was now dangerously slow. Behind them, she could hear the sound of vehicles and search teams beginning to follow their trail through the forest. The spirits of murdered children appeared along the logging road, their ghostly forms providing guidance and encouragement to the exhausted refugees. But Maya realized that supernatural assistance wouldn't be enough if the security teams caught up with them before they reached safety. "How much farther?" asked one of the children, his voice weak with exhaustion. "Not far," Maya lied, knowing that they still had at least half a mile to travel through increasingly treacherous terrain. The logging road was climbing steadily upward, and the thin mountain air made breathing difficult for children whose systems were compromised by experimental drugs. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Maya could hear dogs barking and men shouting coordinates as the security teams followed their trail through the snow. The children were leaving clear tracks that would be impossible to conceal, and their slow pace meant that capture was becoming inevitable. The situation became critical when Maya heard gunshots behind them. The security teams were apparently under orders to prevent the children's escape by any means necessary, including lethal force against both the children and their rescuer. "They're shooting at us," one of the older children said in terror. "Keep moving," Maya replied, though she knew that their chances of reaching safety were diminishing rapidly. The unconscious girl in her arms was getting heavier with each step, and the other children were showing signs of hypothermia that would soon make continued movement impossible. The communications building finally came into view through the trees, its radio towers silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. But Maya could see that security teams had anticipated their destination and were already positioning vehicles around the building to prevent their approach. "It's a trap," Sarah Crowfeather's spirit warned. "They've surrounded the building. If you try to reach it directly, they'll capture you before you can send a distress signal." Maya stopped the group behind a cluster of large pine trees that provided temporary concealment while she tried to figure out an alternative plan. The children were at the limit of their endurance. The security teams were closing in from behind, and their intended refuge was blocked by armed guards. The rescue mission that had begun with hope and supernatural assistance was becoming a deadly trap that would either end with their capture and execution or their deaths from exposure in the Montana wilderness. Maya realized that she needed to find a way to contact Agent Martinez without reaching the communications building, or all 7 of them would join the spirits of the murdered children who were trying to help them escape. The hunt through the mountain forest was approaching its climax, and Maya Henderson was about to discover whether her alliance with the dead would be strong enough to save the living children who depended on her courage and determination. Trapped between pursuing security teams and a surrounded communications building, Maya faced an impossible situation. The 6 rescued children were at the limit of their endurance. The unconscious girl in her arms was showing signs of severe hypothermia, and their options for escape were rapidly disappearing. "There's another way." Sarah Crowfeather's spirit appeared beside Maya with unusual intensity. "The old mining tunnel system that runs under this part of the mountain. It connects to an abandoned mine shaft about 2 miles north of here. If you can reach the entrance, you can contact the outside world from there." "Where's the entrance to the tunnels?" Maya whispered. "Behind the rock outcropping about 100 yards uphill from your position." "But Maya, you need to understand something important. Using those tunnels will awaken all of us who died on this mountain over the past 3 years. Our combined presence will give us enough power to confront Ezra and his entire operation directly." Maya understood that Sarah was offering her more than just an escape route. The spirits of dozens of murdered children were preparing for a final, supernatural confrontation that would either destroy the conspiracy or consume everyone involved in the battle. "What about the living children with me? Will they be safe during whatever you're planning?" "The tunnels will protect them from both the cold and the security teams, but once we begin our assault on the ranch, you'll need to decide whether to stay hidden with the children or help us ensure that no evidence of this conspiracy is destroyed." The sound of approaching vehicles made the decision urgent. Maya gathered the exhausted children around her and began moving uphill toward the rock outcropping that concealed the tunnel entrance. The spirits of murdered children formed a protective perimeter around the group, using their supernatural abilities to muffle sounds and obscure their tracks in the snow. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a natural rock formation that appeared solid until Sarah's spirit guided Maya to a narrow opening barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. The passage led into a network of mining tunnels that had been carved from the mountain decades earlier during Montana's gold rush period. Maya helped each child through the opening, supporting those who were too weak to climb unassisted. The unconscious girl required careful maneuvering to get her through the narrow space without causing additional injury. Inside the tunnels, the temperature was warmer than the external mountain air, and the children could rest without immediate danger of freezing to death. Maya used emergency supplies she found in an old mining station to create makeshift bedding and provide basic medical attention to the most seriously affected children. "How far to the mine shaft where I can send a distress signal?" Maya asked. Sarah's spirit, "About a mile through the main tunnel system. But Maya, before you go, you need to know what's going to happen once you contact law enforcement. The security teams at the ranch will try to destroy all evidence of the experiments and eliminate anyone who can testify about what they've witnessed." The implication was clear. If Maya succeeded in contacting Agent Martinez, the rescued children would become targets for assassination by federal agents who couldn't allow witnesses to survive. The only way to ensure their safety was to eliminate the threat at its source. "What do you need me to do?" Maya asked. Sarah's ghostly form became more solid as other spirits gathered in the tunnel around them. Maya could see dozens of children who had been murdered at Thornfield Ranch, their faces showing the determination of those who had finally found a way to fight back against their killers. "Help us reach the main house where Ezra keeps the master files and communication equipment," Sarah explained. "If we can access those systems, we can transmit evidence of the conspiracy directly to federal authorities while simultaneously exposing everyone involved in the murders." Maya realized that the children's spirits were asking her to leave the rescued victims in the tunnels, while she participated in a supernatural assault on the ranch. The plan would either succeed in exposing the entire conspiracy or result in her death, along with the destruction of all evidence. "I'll do it," Maya said, "but first I need to make sure these children have a way to contact help if something happens to me." She found an old mining radio in the tunnel station and managed to establish contact with the outside world. The signal was weak and intermittent, but she was able to reach the FBI field office in Billings and speak directly with Agent Rebecca Martinez. "This is Maya Henderson calling about missing Native American children," she said into the radio. "I have 6 rescued children and evidence of a government conspiracy involving Thornfield Ranch in the Montana mountains." Agent Martinez's response was immediate and intense. "Maya Henderson, we've been searching for information about Thornfield Ranch for months. Where are you calling from?" "Underground mining tunnels about 2 miles north of the ranch. I have 6 children who were rescued from a federal detention facility where they were being used for psychological experiments. They need immediate medical attention and protection. Can you give me specific coordinates for your location?" Maya provided the GPS coordinates from the mining station's emergency equipment, then continued with the crucial information. "Agent Martinez, the conspiracy involves federal agents from multiple agencies. Children are being kidnapped from reservations under false emergency removal orders, then subjected to torture and murder at facilities across the northern Plains states. How many children are we talking about?" "Based on the files I photographed, over 60 children have been murdered at Thornfield Ranch alone. There are similar facilities in Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota. The operation has congressional oversight and receives federal funding through shell organizations. Agent Martinez was quiet for a moment, apparently processing the scope of what Maya was describing. Maya, I need you to stay hidden with those children until federal agents can reach your location. We'll coordinate with military units to ensure safe extraction from the mountain. There's something else you need to know. The security teams at the ranch have orders to eliminate all witnesses and destroy all evidence if they discover that. Law enforcement is responding to the situation. If you want to preserve evidence and testimony, you need to move immediately. Understood. How long can you maintain your current position? Maya looked around the tunnel at the exhausted children who were depending on her for survival. Maybe 6 hours if the children don't develop complications from exposure or drug effects. But Agent Martinez, the people responsible for this conspiracy, will try to escape if they realize that federal agents are coming. You need to coordinate simultaneous raids on multiple facilities to prevent evidence destruction. After ending the radio contact, Maya prepared to leave the children in the relative safety of the tunnels while she returned to the surface to assist. The spirits of murdered children in their final confrontation with Ezra and his operation. The oldest of the rescued children, the 14-year-old boy who had shown the most resilience during their escape, spoke to her as she prepared to leave. "Are you coming back for us?" he asked. "Federal agents are on their way to get you to safety," Maya replied. "If I don't come back, Agent Martinez knows where you are, and she'll make sure you get home to your families." "What about the other kids who were killed here? Will anyone remember them?" Maya felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she thought about Sarah Crowfeather and the dozens of other children whose lives had been destroyed by the conspiracy. They're going to be remembered, and the people who killed them are going to pay for what they've done. The spirits of murdered children were waiting for Maya when she emerged from the tunnel system. Their ghostly forms had become more solid and defined, powered by righteous anger and the proximity of justice. Sarah Crowfeather led the supernatural army as they moved through the forest toward Thornfield Ranch. "The security teams are regrouping at the main house," Sarah explained. "They've received orders to destroy all physical evidence and eliminate anyone who might testify about the experiments. Ezra is preparing to evacuate key personnel while leaving the guards to cover their escape." Maya could see lights blazing throughout the ranch complex as the conspiracy's leaders implemented their emergency protocols. Vehicles were being loaded with equipment and documents, and she could hear radio communications coordinating the destruction of evidence. The supernatural. Assault began as the spirits of murdered children focused their combined energy on the ranch's infrastructure. Electronic systems failed throughout the property, vehicles wouldn't start, and communication equipment malfunctioned as the ghosts of Ezra's victims used their otherworldly power to trap the living conspirators at the scene of their crimes. "They can't escape now," Sarah told Maya, "but we need you to access Ezra's office and transmit the evidence files to law enforcement while we keep the security teams occupied." Maya realized that her final task would be to return to the office where her investigation had begun, this time with the supernatural support needed to ensure that the truth about Thornfield Ranch would be exposed regardless of what happened to her personally. The spirits of dozens of murdered Native American children formed a protective escort as Maya Henderson, the former foster kid from Detroit who had taken a caretaker job to escape poverty, prepared to confront the architects of one of the most horrific government conspiracies in American history. The final battle between the living and the dead was beginning, and the outcome would determine whether justice would finally be served for the children who had been tortured and murdered in the isolated mountains of Montana. Maya reached Ezra's office as the supernatural siege of Thornfield Ranch intensified. Around her, The spirits of murdered children had grown so powerful that their presence was affecting the physical world in dramatic ways. Electronic systems failed throughout the complex, vehicles refused to start, and the temperature inside buildings dropped to near freezing levels as the ghosts channeled their collective rage into a coordinated assault on their killers. Through the office windows, Maya could see security personnel running between buildings in panic as their equipment malfunctioned and their communication systems went dead. Emergency lights flickered erratically, and the backup generators that powered the research facilities began shutting down one by one. The files are in the central computer system. Sarah Crowfeather's spirit appeared beside Maya, more solid and defined than ever before. Everything about the nationwide network, the federal funding sources, the research protocols, the body disposal sites. But you have to upload everything before Ezra triggers the data destruction protocols. Maya powered up Ezra's computer system, which had been protected from the supernatural electromagnetic interference by specialized shielding. The login screen required administrator passwords, but the children's spirits were able to manipulate the electronic systems directly, bypassing security measures through supernatural means. The files that appeared on the screen revealed the full scope of a conspiracy that dwarfed anything Maya had imagined. Operation Broken Arrow was a classified federal program operating under the authority of a joint task force that included representatives from the CIA, Department of Defense, Department of Health and Human Services, and Department of Homeland Security. The stated objective was to develop enhanced interrogation and cultural modification techniques that could be applied to domestic and international populations considered threats to national security. Native American children had been selected as test subjects because their cultural identity was considered particularly resistant to traditional assimilation methods. The program operated 17 facilities across 12 states, each disguised as legitimate child welfare or educational institutions. Children were kidnapped from reservations using fabricated emergency removal orders, then subjected to systematic torture designed to destroy their psychological resilience and cultural connections. Successful test subjects were transferred to urban foster care systems where they would be monitored for long-term behavioral modification effects. Those who proved resistant to the conditioning were murdered and their bodies disposed of in remote locations that would never be searched. Maya began uploading the files to a secure federal database that Agent Martinez had provided access codes for. During their radio communication, the upload would provide irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy while simultaneously alerting federal authorities to the locations of all 17 facilities. But as the data transfer progressed, Maya heard explosions throughout the ranch complex. Ezra and his federal handlers were implementing emergency protocols to destroy physical evidence, even if it meant killing their own personnel who couldn't be evacuated in time. "They're going to blow up Building 12, Sarah warned. "If any of the research equipment or test subjects survive, it could provide evidence that contradicts their cover story about accidental explosions." Maya realized that the 6 children she had rescued were still in danger. Even though they were hidden in the mining tunnels, the explosions at the ranch might cause cave-ins or other structural damage that could trap them underground. "I have to go back for them," Maya said. "Finish the upload first," Sarah insisted. "If those files aren't transmitted completely, all of our deaths will be meaningless. The children in the tunnels are safe for now, but this evidence is the only thing that will prevent this from happening again at other facilities." The computer screen showed the upload progress approaching 90% completion when the office door burst open. Ezra Thornfield entered carrying an assault rifle, his massive frame silhouetted against the emergency lighting in the hallway. "Step away from the computer," he commanded. "The upload stops now." Maya positioned herself between Ezra and the computer, though she knew her physical presence wouldn't be enough to stop him if he decided to destroy the equipment. It's too late. Agent Martinez already has enough evidence to shut down the entire program. Ezra raised his weapon. Agent Martinez won't live long enough to act on any evidence. Our people in the Bureau are already moving to eliminate her and anyone else who might threaten program security. The revelation that the conspiracy included agents within the FBI itself made Maya understand that even successful transmission of the evidence might not guarantee justice. The network of corrupt officials was extensive enough to suppress investigations and eliminate threats from within law enforcement agencies. But as Ezra prepared to shoot Maya and destroy the computer, the spirits of murdered children manifested in the office with unprecedented power. Sarah Crowfeather appeared directly between Maya and Ezra's rifle, her ghostly form solid enough to deflect the bullets when he fired. The supernatural intervention escalated as dozens of other spirits converged on Ezra with the combined fury of all the children he had tortured and murdered. The temperature plunged below zero. Frost covered every surface in the room, and Ezra found himself surrounded by the ghostly forms of his victims. "We told you we were freezing," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of death and justice. "Now you'll know how it feels to die from cold and fear." The spirits began inflicting on Ezra the same hypothermia torture he had used to kill them. His massive frame began shaking uncontrollably as supernatural cold penetrated his body, causing the same agonizing death process he had inflicted on dozens of innocent children. Maya watched in fascination and horror as Ezra Thornfield experienced justice delivered by the spirits of his victims. But she forced herself to focus on completing the evidence upload, knowing that Ezra's death would be meaningless if the larger conspiracy remained intact. The computer screen showed 100% completion, just as explosions rocked the ranch complex. Building 12 erupted in flames, followed by the administrative buildings and research facilities. The federal agents were implementing their scorched earth protocols, destroying everything that might provide evidence of their crimes. But Maya's upload had succeeded in transmitting complete documentation of Operation Broken Arrow to Agent Martinez's secure servers. The evidence included financial records, personnel files, experimental protocols, and correspondence that proved federal involvement in the systematic torture and murder of Native American children. As the ranch buildings burned around them, Maya felt the children's spirits beginning to fade. Their mission was complete, and their supernatural energy was being released as they found the peace that had been denied to them in life. "Thank you," Sarah Crowfeather said, her form becoming translucent, as she prepared to move on to whatever came after justice. "The children in the tunnels are safe, and the evidence you transmitted will save hundreds of other children from experiencing what we went through." "What happens now?" Maya asked. "Now you become the witness who speaks for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The living need someone to tell our stories and make sure they're never forgotten." The spirits faded completely as dawn broke over the burning remains of Thornfield Ranch. Maya made her way back through the chaos to the mining tunnels where the 6 rescued children waited for extraction by federal agents who could be trusted. Agent Martinez arrived with a full tactical team within 3 hours, coordinating the medical evacuation of the rescued children while beginning the massive investigation that would expose Operation Broken Arrow and bring justice to everyone involved in the conspiracy. Maya Henderson emerged from the Montana mountains as the sole surviving witness to one of the most horrific government programs in American history, carrying the voices of murdered children and the evidence needed to ensure that their deaths would not be forgotten or repeated. 18 months after the destruction of Thornfield Ranch, Maya Henderson stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., delivering testimony that would reshape federal child welfare policies and expose the deepest levels of government corruption in modern American history. The hearing room was packed with media representatives, tribal leaders, and family members of the murdered children whose cases had finally received the attention they deserved. The investigation that had begun with Maya's desperate attempt to save 6 kidnapped children had expanded into the largest federal corruption prosecution since Watergate. Operation Broken Arrow's 17 facilities had been raided simultaneously across 12 states, resulting in the rescue of over 200 children and the arrest of more than 300 conspirators. Congressional Committee Chairman David Stronghart, himself a member of the Cherokee Nation, leaned forward as Maya concluded her prepared statement. Ms. Henderson, in your professional opinion as someone who has now worked with federal investigators for over a year, how many children do you estimate were murdered by this conspiracy? Maya consulted the thick binder of evidence she had helped compile during months of investigation with Agent Martinez and her expanding team of federal prosecutors. Based on facility records, disposal site excavations, and testimony from rescued survivors, we've documented the murders of at least 437 Native American children over a 6-year operational period. The number sent ripples of shock and grief through the hearing room. Family members who had spent years searching for missing children now understood that their loved ones had been systematically murdered by federal agents operating under classified authorities. And the financial scope of the fraud involved in funding these operations, Chairman Stronghart continued. Operation Broken Arrow received approximately $250 million in federal funding through shell organizations and legitimate-sounding research grants. Additional funding came from private contractors who were developing commercial applications for the psychological conditioning techniques being tested on the children. Maya's testimony revealed that the conspiracy had extended far beyond simple murder and child abuse. The techniques developed through torturing Native American children were being sold to private prison companies, immigration detention contractors, and foreign governments seeking methods for controlling indigenous populations worldwide. Representative Jennifer Clearwater from the House Committee on Oversight and Reform asked the question that had haunted Maya throughout the investigation. Ms. Henderson, how were these operations able to continue for so long without detection by legitimate law enforcement or child welfare agencies? Maya took a deep breath before answering, knowing that her response would implicate federal agencies at the highest levels. The conspiracy included personnel from the FBI, CIA, Department of Health and Human Services, and Department of Homeland Security. Missing children reports were intercepted and suppressed before they could trigger legitimate investigations. Families who asked too many questions were intimidated by federal agents or had their own legal status threatened. The hearing room erupted as Maya detailed how congressional oversight had been circumvented through classified designation of the program, and how budget appropriations had been hidden within legitimate defense and homeland security spending. Congressional leadership knew about Operation Broken Arrow, Representative Clearwater pressed. At least 12 members of Congress received briefings about enhanced interrogation research using volunteer subjects from disadvantaged communities. The classified nature of the briefings prevented most participants from understanding the full scope of what they were approving. Maya's testimony continued for 3 days, during which she provided detailed evidence about each facility, named specific individuals responsible for murders and cover-ups, and explained how the conspiracy had used legitimate federal agencies as cover for systematic genocide. The political earthquake that followed her testimony resulted in the resignation of 2 cabinet secretaries, the retirement of 14 members of Congress, and criminal charges against over 40 federal officials. Agent Rebecca Martinez was promoted to lead a new FBI task force dedicated to investigating corruption in federal child welfare programs. But for Maya, the most meaningful outcome of the investigation wasn't the political consequences or the massive financial settlements awarded to victims' families. It was the closure provided to communities that had spent years wondering what had happened to their missing children. Tribal councils across the northern plains finally learned the truth about children who had vanished after visits from federal social workers. Families received remains for proper burial according to traditional customs. Communities could begin healing processes that had been impossible, while the fate of their children remained unknown. Maya's role as the primary witness in the congressional hearings had transformed her from a desperate teenager seeking survival, employment, into one of the most recognizable advocates for Native American rights in the country. Universities offered her scholarships to study law or social work. Civil rights organizations invited her to join their leadership teams. Media outlets competed for exclusive interviews about her experiences, but Maya chose a different path. Using the substantial financial reward provided by federal whistleblower protections, she established the Sarah Crow Feather Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting Native American children from government overreach and supporting families affected by the Thornfield Ranch conspiracy. The foundation's headquarters was built on land donated by the Crow Nation in southeastern Montana, far from the isolated mountains where so many children had died. Maya hired staff who were themselves survivors of federal abuse programs, creating an organization that understood from personal experience the trauma inflicted by government agencies that claimed to be helping vulnerable populations. Dr. Angela Whitehawk, a psychologist and member of the Lakota Nation, became the foundation's clinical director. During their first meeting at the new headquarters, Dr. Whitehawk asked Maya about the supernatural experiences that had made her investigation possible. "Do you still hear their voices?" Dr. Whitehawk asked. "The children who were murdered at Thornfield Ranch." Maya considered the question carefully. Since the destruction of the ranch and the arrest of the conspirators, her communication with the spirits had changed. The urgent, angry voices that had guided her investigation had been replaced by a sense of peaceful presence that came to her during moments of quiet reflection. "Sometimes," Maya admitted, "but it's different now. They're not seeking justice anymore because justice has been served. Now they seem to be encouraging the work we're doing to prevent other children from experiencing what they went through." The Foundation's first major project was establishing a rapid response network for families whose children went missing under suspicious circumstances involving federal agencies. Maya and her team developed protocols for documenting disappearances, coordinating with trustworthy law enforcement officers, and providing legal representation for families navigating federal bureaucracy. Within 6 months of opening, the Foundation had intervened in over 40 cases where Native American children had been removed from their families under questionable circumstances. In 32 of those cases, they were able to secure the children's return home, after proving that the removal orders had been based on fabricated reports or corrupt investigations. Maya's work also extended to supporting the criminal prosecutions that resulted from the Operation Broken Arrow investigation. She testified in dozens of trials, helping prosecutors explain how the conspiracy had operated and ensuring that everyone responsible for the murders faced appropriate consequences. The trials revealed additional details about the scope and brutality of the program that hadn't emerged during the congressional hearings. Defense contractors had bid for contracts to expand the psychological conditioning techniques to immigration detention centers and overseas military facilities. International clients had expressed interest in purchasing the research data for use in controlling their own indigenous populations. Some of the most shocking testimony came from Dr. Richard Brennan, the chief psychologist for Operation Broken Arrow, who agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Dr. Brennan revealed that the techniques developed at Thornfield Ranch and similar facilities had been used to train interrogators working at military detention centers and CIA black sites around the world. The research objective was to develop methods that could break down psychological resistance in any population, Dr. Brennan testified. Native American children were selected as test subjects because their cultural identity was considered the most resistant to modification. If we could successfully destroy their connection to tribal culture, we could apply the same techniques to any group. The international implications of Operation Broken Arrow led to investigations by human rights organizations and foreign governments whose citizens had been subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques developed through the torture of American children. The United Nations launched a formal investigation into human rights violations by the United States government. Maya found herself testifying before international tribunals and working with organizations around the world that were documenting similar programs in other countries. The techniques developed at Thornfield Ranch had been exported globally as part of America's counterterrorism efforts, resulting in the torture and murder of children on every continent. But despite the global scope of the corruption she had exposed, Maya remained focused on the individual stories of the children whose deaths had made her investigation possible. She established memorial gardens at each of the 17 facility sites, creating spaces where families could honor their murdered children and communities could heal from the trauma of systematic government betrayal. The memorial at the Thornfield Ranch site was the largest and most elaborate. Built into the mountainside where Building 12 had once stood, it featured traditional Native American architectural elements and storytelling features that preserved the memory of every child who had died there. During the memorial's dedication ceremony, attended by tribal leaders from across the region and federal officials seeking to demonstrate their commitment to justice, Maya experienced one final communication from Sarah Crow Feather's spirit. "Our stories will be remembered now," Sarah's voice whispered on the mountain wind. "Children who come after us will know that someone fought for justice when we couldn't fight for ourselves. That's all we ever wanted." Maya Henderson, who had started her adult life washing corpses for survival wages in Detroit's urban decay, had become the voice that ensured the murdered children of Operation Broken Arrow would never be forgotten. The foundation she established continued growing, expanding its mission to protect vulnerable children from government abuse and ensuring that the systematic horrors of Thornfield Ranch would never be repeated. Her transformation from desperate teenager to nationally recognized advocate proved that sometimes the most important battles for justice were fought by people who had no choice but to succeed, because failure meant watching more innocent lives be destroyed by those who wielded power without accountability. The spirits of 437 murdered children had found their voice through Maya Henderson, and their stories would continue inspiring protection for vulnerable populations as long as governments existed with the power to harm those they claimed to serve. In the isolated mountains of Montana, where children had once died in supernatural cold and terror, their memory now stood as an eternal reminder that justice could transcend death itself when someone was brave enough to speak truth to power. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.